long have we known each other?
1987.
Yeah. Or less, actually, more than that. 1985, maybe? No, 86. All right. 86. Okay, so Alan was my youth pastor when I was 16, 17. 16, that's what I thought, you see. So 16, anyway. 16, 17. And so and when I became a leader, used to go to his place, which was on the Wigram Air Force Base, which now no longer exists. Some of you probably live there now, where the Air Force Base was, but we would toddle over there and come and visit you in there, and it was quite a lot of fun, really. So Lieutenant, I can't remember what you were, but anyway. So it's been a while, right? And then Alan was the pastor at Southwest Baptist, so when I was working there, he was my boss, but he wasn't very bossy. He was just very kind and lovely. And now Alan is the director of...
NZBMS, New Zealand Baptist Mission Work. Well, I'll get to that.
Are you going to tell? Oh, I'm stealing your thunder. I will just let you go. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you that Alan is with us this morning. I thank you for the word that you have on his heart to share with us this morning. Lord, may we have hearts that are open to hear your words coming out of his mouth, your words that settle in our fertile soil well. Holy Spirit, just breathe on the words that he speaks and let them go deep and grow great roots. In your name, amen.
Thank you very much, Rich. Appreciate it.
This is for you to take.
Thank you. Thank you. Not even sure I better get it in my bag, but yeah, I'll do my best. I'm going to India tomorrow, so yeah. Kia ora te whānau, araha te whānau. It's good to be with you today. I'm going to take us back to a passage that you may have looked at earlier in the year. So it's a really famous kind of Old Testament, First Testament passage in Isaiah, and it was part of what we do in terms of the 240 Baptist churches that make up the churches of New Zealand. We do 3 weeks looking at the world, and this is one of them. And so the passage I want to look at is in Isaiah 43, and I want to start by reading it. Last time I read this was in Kaikoui, so way up in the north. And there was this little boy there who had never been to church before. He lived with his grandma, and a neighbour brought him to church. And I read the first slide and noticed that he was reading with me. And then I gave him the microphone, and as an 8-year-old, maybe 9-year-old, he read the whole lot right through, which I was really, really impressed with. So if there is another 9-year-old who wants to take over, you're very welcome. Even I am the Lord, and apart from me there is no Saviour. I have revealed and saved and proclaimed. I am not some foreign god among you. You are my witnesses. We are the witnesses to what God is doing. Declares the Lord that I am God. Yes, and from ancient days I am He. No one can deliver out of my hand. When I act, who can reverse it? I am the Lord, your Holy One, Israel's Creator, your King. This is what the Lord says. He who made a way through the sea, a path through the mighty waters, who drew out the chariots and horses, the army and the reinforcements together, and they lay there never to rise again, extinguished, snuffed out like a wick. He's referring back to when the people of God were slaves in Egypt, and God rescued them out of slavery, and they came across the Dead Sea, and they entered the Promised Land. The Red Sea, I should say, not the Dead Sea, Red Sea. And in that journey, God led them right through. And then he says, remember this, remember who I am. And then this next line, forget the former things. All these wonderful things God has done, and now he says, forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you perceive it? I am making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. The wild animals honor me, and the jackals and the owls, because I provide water in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland, to give drink to my people, my chosen, the people I form for myself, that they may proclaim my praise. I want to take you back and tell you a little bit of a backstory of what is New Zealand Baptist Mission Society. Now, you have to go back probably further than any of you who are alive today, certainly before I had Rach in our youth group. So I want to go back to 1885. No one around then? And I want to do a little bit of what's called dendrochronology. You know the rings of a tree? If you are a scientist who studies the life of the tree by reading the rings, then what you're engaging in is dendrochronology. So if you want to go home today and impress somebody over lunch or over dinner, if you stay here for lunch, just say, oh, this morning we learned about dendrochronology. They'll be impressed and say, what the heck is dendrochronology? Well, it's how to read the rings of a tree and to tell the life of the tree by reading its rings. When there was a fire, when there was great rain and the tree could grow quickly, when the tree was starved and it only grew a little amount, when there was pestilence or a disease, all of it's told in the rings of the tree's life. You know, every time the earth goes around the sun, we have birthday cards and cake. Well, trees don't get birthday cards and cake. They lay down another ring that tells their story in every part of their trunk and branches. And so we can read that story. And so if we go back to 1885 and read the story of our mission agency, they gathered in Dunedin. There were 25 people representing about 27 churches, the Baptist churches of the time, and at the time we made up 2,588 people across the whole of New Zealand. And they decided this the third gathering of Baptist people, 25 people present, 12 of them were pastors, 13 of them weren't, that they wanted to do something to start mission work in the world. And what they did was they sent a year later, sorry, I went the wrong way there. They sent a year later this woman, and her name was Rosalie McGeorge. She'd come from Australia. She was 26 years old. She was a school teacher. And she said she had a heart to go to India. And so she went to India, and there she refused to do what everyone else did in terms of mission work. She didn't live in a compound with the other Europeans. She went and lived with a Hindu family in their house. She dressed as an Indian. She learnt the language. She ate the food. Eventually, she lived in a shed at the back of the house, and she would go and work with women who were locked into their homes and couldn't get out and tell them something about Jesus. Now, the sad thing about Rosalie McGeorge is she did this work for 6 years. She got typhoid and she died. But her life excited 5 other women. One of the other women who went also died. 2 got ill and came back to New Zealand. 1 got married and left. And 1, Emma Beckinsale, stayed there for 40 years. And she started a woman's home of hope for women who were destitute and had nothing. And that was the beginnings of what we were involved in, or our grandparents' were involved in. And starting something that God was weaving together as God took people from the Southwest Pacific and wove them into the lives of people in Northeast India. Why did God do that? I don't know, but God did. And so that's the first ring I want to look at. The second ring would be in what's now Bangladesh, Brahmanbaria, and particularly a man by the name of John Takel, who was one of the first Christians to work exclusively with the Muslim people. And for 20 years he exchanged with Muslims and talked about their faith and his faith and talked about who Jesus was with the Muslim community. And now there's still a library up there recognizing his work. Let me pull out again to another ring further out. This is Champur, also in Bangladesh, where your forebears planted a hospital. It had 4 wards, 24 beds, 1 operating theatre. The doctor who went was the Dr. Charles North. In 9 years, they saw 78,000 patients from 1,200 villages. That's the sort of thing collectively in our history that we've been part of. Then in the early 1930s, this couple were involved in North India. Can this slide and a few others from here on not go on the live stream, please? Involved in northern India. And this couple, Malcolm, met one of the officials of the Maharaja. The Maharaja ruled this state, had done for hundreds of years, successive Maharaja. And he said to the official, "That's a nice elephant you've got." And the official started talking to him. You see, for decades, no Christian had been able to get into that state. But because of the conversation between him and the official of the Maharaja, a letter was able to be taken to the Maharaja. And he said, "Yes, you can come into my kingdom. I will give you 45 acres, which is now in the middle of the city, still there. And I will give you my protection, and you can share the gospel." I want to tell you more about that later. Let me pull the rings out again to the 1970s. Now, some of us were alive in the 1970s, me included. Many of you weren't. But a guy by the name of Brian Smith and others went to the same place in northeast India and translated the New Testament into the language of the Cookbrook people. And that began a real work amongst the tribal peoples in that area. It actually was the first time the language was ever written down. And today there's a university there where the whole learning of history and English is all done, well, the language is all done, the poetry and the writing of the language is all done in the language that was written down by Brian Smith. Let me go one last time. In 1999, the year 2000, a group from churches like this went and planted businesses in Calcutta. Business as mission. Business for freedom, to set particularly women free who had been trafficked from other parts of Asia and forced into prostitution, to provide them alternative and solid, reliable forms of work, to give them a vocational future. Now that's our story. That's your story. You probably didn't know it. But collectively as Baptists, we've done this down through the decades. Some of you do know that story. Let me push out. Now, I'm wearing a t-shirt today that in the symbol in the O is the story of the tree and those rings. Because we've been called NZBMS for a long time. But actually, Baptist Missionary Society doesn't work in India. They don't like those words. It doesn't work in the big country where we work, which is the biggest country in the world. I won't say the name. It doesn't work in Thailand, which is the biggest Thai country. It doesn't work in Bangladesh, where we work, the fourth largest Muslim country in the world, with 167 million people, where 0.3% of them are Christian, where most people will live and die and never meet a Christian in their lifetime. It's the lowest number of Christians of any Muslim country in the world. And being NZBMS doesn't work in those spaces. And so we've taken on a new name. And the name is about the kind of mission that we're involved in. The kind of mission we want to be part of is where God works intimately, personally, closely with people. See, that circle in the middle could also be a fingerprint. That God has got to stamp his fingerprint on every life and wants to work personally with every individual to bring them to know who Jesus is. And so what we're about is a hand-carved mission. Not a multiplied mission where you're trying to reach, 5 million people with some program, but individually, people by people, village by village, culture by culture, with a real respect and understanding of each people. And so we've changed our name about 2 weeks ago to Aratahi. What does Aratahi mean? Well, firstly, it's a word that is a name which has been gifted to us by our Māori leaders in our Baptist movement. It means to be focused together on one thing. Aro, to focus, to see, to perceive, if you like, on one thing, the work of God in the world. And so we've been known as NZBMS, but for the future we'll be known as Aratahi, bringing a New Zealand hand-carved sense of mission into places like India and Bangladesh and China and Thailand and other parts of the world. And God has done remarkable things. Remarkable things. You know that place I told you about? Well, I'll read the passage again. But forget the former things. Do not dwell on the past. See, I'm doing a new thing. What about those new things? Well, the word perceive Do you perceive it in that passage? Could we change to the word whakarongo, a Māori word, where whaka means to cause something to happen, to cause to be. What is God causing to be today? And to hear or to see or to sense it. You know, Māori were great navigators. And as navigators, they had other skills than GPS, compasses, and maps. They could read the waves. They could read the clouds. They could follow the patterns of the birds. They could see the phosphorus on the top of the waves. And sometimes they'd lie on the bottom of their craft and feel the echo of land in the waves as it hit their body. Great navigators. What is God doing that's new? I don't know. I kind of want to ask you to turn to a couple of people around you and say, as you look around Riccarton Baptist Church, as you look around your neighbourhood, as you look around what you're sensing when you pray, what is God doing that's new? God's done some wonderful things in the past. I've told you some wonderful things of our collective Baptist mission work. But what do you sense might be new? Where's God planting a new thing and giving birth to a new part of God's work? In you, in your church, in your community, in the world. Can I ask people to talk to each other? You're pretty good at talking? Okay. That's all right. We'll manage that. I've got a booming voice. I'll get you back. Grab 2 or 3 people. Where do you sense God might be doing something new? Okay. 2, 3, 4. They won't bite, I promise. Okay. Could your group of 2 or 3 tell another group what you sensed? Did you get that? Could your group of 2 or 3 link up with another group and share, this is what we sensed, so that we get to share the stories? We probably won't get to hear them all, but it'd be neat for 2 groups to talk to each other. So you may have to move, but apparently it's okay to move. Yeah. What did you guys hear? And to share the stories. Okay, about a minute to go. About a minute to go, and then we'll drag it back in. Okay, can I drag you back this way? Hopefully there's something in there that's kind of encouraging in the mix, or at least a possibility of what God's doing. And those of you who are watching by live stream, hopefully you've had a chance to either sit back in your lounge chair and think about it, or share it with whoever you're with in your home. Whakarongo is to mean to really listen and to really sense what God's doing. And in the passage it says God's doing a new thing. Do you perceive it? And I'm absolutely certain that God is doing a new thing. Our world is now changing quickly, and the pandemic only sped up that change. And God is in the midst of doing something new and something fresh. The question isn't whether God's doing something. The question is, do we see it? Do we perceive it? Do we hear it? Will we be part of it? Let me carry on with a little bit more of the story. There's open doors that God will be opening. They may not be the doors that were open yesterday, but God opens new doors and calls us individually and collectively to go through them. See, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. Do you not perceive it? I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. You know what God did in the old days was He opened up the sea so the people could pass. So God made the wet dry. Right? Here God's saying, I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. So the God who made the wet dry is now making the dry wet. God does new things in our midst. The wild animals honor me, the jackals and the owls, because I provide water in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. That's what Isaiah is saying 600 years before Jesus. God's doing a new thing, and it's wonderful. And it's much bigger than we could ever perceive what God is doing. So let me tell you a couple of stories. You know that place, please don't film this bit again, that place I told you about in northern India, that state where the Maharaja was and the elephant? Today, there are 997 churches that call you their grandparents, that treat New Zealanders like absolute royalty, because it was your ancestors who took the gospel to this community. And those 997 churches exist and continue today because of what people from this church and other churches around New Zealand began. If you look at those figures, 15,000 new baptized believers during the pandemic. This is a church which is booming. God's doing something incredibly fresh and new, and it's exciting. In the West, in countries like New Zealand, the church is struggling, but that is not true in countries and places like this. Tribal peoples who are coming to faith in great numbers. If you can read the bottom there, so 997 churches, 118 pastors. Now, some of you do maths. And you who do maths will go, there's something wrong there. Because most pastors there have 3, 4, 5, 7, up to 20 churches that they look after. They can't train pastors fast enough. This is the college that is involved in training pastors. This year they're training 23. Next year they've got a dream that there'll be 40 students so they can train more. When I was there in March this year, just go back one and see if it's there. Yes, there it is. When I was there in March this year, you may be able to pick me in the crowd. Oh, the short fella, that's it. Thanks, Jackie. Do you notice something there? There's about 9 young women. They are training women to be evangelists and pastors for the first time. They opened a hostel specifically for women. This is a big new thing that God is doing in the midst of this community. I went to this school. It had been closed for nearly 18 months because of the pandemic. It was week 2 when I got there. There are 3,000 students there, all trained on this 45 acres that was given all those years ago. All trained in English because it's the language that gets people jobs in government, in business, and all across different places. The kids were so excited to be back. After 18 months of being doing schooling on one phone that probably 5 or 6 kids were all trying to do their schooling on, suddenly they were back with their mates, and it's growing. It was Holly. And you know, being involved with what God is doing is so much fun. It's one of my mates there who's working there and just throwing dye at each other and enjoying the fun of what God brings in these different communities. God's doing a new thing. This is a new building that's going up where in 2020 there was a fire and then a flood and the building was destroyed. Now there's a new building. Do you know why? Because of a church at Porirua Baptist Church that remarkably gave $135,000 to rebuild the building so the work could carry on. This is working with women who have been forced into prostitution and providing them separate and alternative work. A building that's been there for a long time in the biggest red light district in Calcutta. Repainted, refurbished, redone up. God's doing new things. And the name of this organisation is Joya. And yes, they provide a business that provides real work, but they don't only do that, they provide education. So all the staff get to choose 2 hours a week of learning something. At the moment, there's 3 things they want to learn. They want to learn how to use a computer, makes sense. They want to learn how to speak English, kind of makes sense. And the biggest grouping, they want to learn how to ride a push bike. So there's a bunch of women in saris, 2 hours every week, riding around on the rooftop of that building, that one, learning how to ride a bike, so they can ride a bike safely on the rooftop before they get on the road, which in Calcutta is more of a mission. God's doing new stuff. 6,000 hours every month educating kids, feeding families. 7 lawyers working with them, providing documentation to the woman so they can have mail sent to them. They can have a passport. They can have proof of identity. They can prove that they can live somewhere. God's doing neat stuff and new stuff. This is one of their parties. These are the women that I'm talking about, just celebrating the joy of where they're working. You know that picture I showed you of the holly? The 2 women on the far right-hand side, they're hard to see. They are naughty. They were determined to get me covered in dye. But they also took me to their house. And this is their house. And gave me lunch, which was incredibly kind. And down there you can see a tree. Well, the doorway's between the tree and a brick wall and a marquee, bit of a plastic wall. And inside, it's hard to see with the light, it's not the great photo, are these two women who were after me with the dye. And there's two things in that place they're so proud of. And one of them's in the top picture, you can see it is called a gas cooker, a 2-ring gas cooker. Because they're working, they were able to save up to buy a gas cooker, which means you don't have to light a fire every morning. You don't have to scavenge for firewood in a city of 14 million people where finding wood is hard. And the other thing, well, they're leaning against it here. It's purple. It's called a fridge. Keeps their food safe. And their work has enabled them to have that. And this is where they live. In 1885, God placed on the hearts of people in New Zealand Baptists, that we'd go to the least reached, those who had least chance of knowing Jesus, and the most poor. And God is doing new stuff, and it's exciting, but we're still going to the least reached and to the most poor, because they are the people on God's heart. Bless you. Thanks for listening.